Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Furiously Curious Show. I'm your host, Calvin Rentberg. This is a show that learns about people's worldviews, beliefs, and stories from people around the world. How I grew up and what I was taught shaped me and what I believe. Now I want to learn about other people's stories, beliefs, worldviews, and how they got there. New episodes drop every other Friday. Today on the show we have John Less. He's a husband, father, and grandfather, a Canadian politician and former member of the Legislative Assembly for British Columbia. He served as Minister for Small Business and Economic Development, Minister of Public Safety, and Solicitor-General for the Provincial Government of BC. John, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
No worries. Episode number 1, so hopefully this goes well.
Episode number 1, so we get the chance to set a trend or something.
Hopefully. Hopefully.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to this. I've seen a number of these things created by others, of course, and I always find them fairly interesting, depending on the topic that's under discussion. But technology today makes a lot of different avenues of communication possible.
That's right, yeah. So, have you done quite a few podcasts, or is this...
I've done a few.
Yeah.
Done a few. The old-fashioned media, of course, much more of that. At the beginning of my political career, which was in 1983, local radio station, Let's Talk program with Bill Coombs, that kind of thing. And later on, of course, as we moved into provincial politics, then it was more television-based. Dealing with all kinds of media, though, print and TV and radio, and that kind of thing. Yeah. So, media certainly is part of the political business around the world.
Yeah. Are you happy that you're not in politics now anymore with like the social media side of the things? Because that's massive nowadays, especially for politicians. Make sure they get that right and having teams that put the right content. And
it's on the one hand, it's an amazing tool. To reach out to a lot of people quickly. On the other hand, it's a cesspool. And it's probably only a small minority of people that make it that. But that distance that's inherent in social media, or at least that presumption of distance, gives some people, I guess, the latitude to just be... for lack of a better word, rude, totally unbecoming, I've known politicians who have shut off all of their social media feeds simply because they couldn't take it anymore.
Wow. So they don't have accounts anymore, or they just don't look at it themselves?
Shut it down altogether.
Wow.
Yeah. It can be quite brutal.
Yeah.
Some people just don't care what they say.
Yeah.
And when a pile-on starts on social media, it's a fearsome thing to behold.
Yeah.
I've known somebody else in the professional realm who had caught up in one of these pile-ons in Twitter, and he shut his Twitter account down.
Crazy.
It was just too crazy.
It's amazing how quick it changed, though, because you have like Barack Obama, for example, 2008, just when BlackBerries were around, and he wanted to bring that into office.
Yep.
I think they let him eventually.
Yep.
And now you have Donald Trump, who is, initially people thought he was crazy for everything on Twitter, but now it's just the norm. And
well, Trump is president because he used Twitter.
That's
so
right,
much.
directly to the...
No question about it.
Yeah.
He was never going to be able to rely on the media to get through to the American people.
Yeah.
And this isn't a commentary on whether he's right or wrong. No, this is just, that's the way he was able to communicate with people.
Yeah.
And obviously it resonated
to
enough of an extent that it got him elected.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump, 10 years previous, wouldn't have had nearly the same success.
Can't connect to the people directly like he did.
That's right, exactly. So, and the upcoming election in the U.S. this November is going to be the same thing all over again. He's going to be reaching around the media, so fascinating to watch. Not always edifying.
Not always edifying. That's a good point. It's interesting, though, because they always say that the media has to keep politicians accountable, but it's almost happening the other way around as well now.
Yep.
Because he has that same access to the people that
that's right.
The media always has.
Yeah, and he's pretty adept at offering his own opinion on what the media is all about.
Yeah.
He invented, I think, the term fake news.
Yeah.
When you watch some of the rallies that he does, he hasn't done them as frequently of late, but he's not afraid to call them out.
No, it was actually interesting. I was at the NRA show last year, and I was right in the front, and he was doing his speech. And so you have all the big TV camera guys in the back recording the whole thing, and he's pointing directly at him and telling him exactly what was up. And
Does it every time.
Yeah, it was pretty entertaining actually to see that.
Yeah, like I say, it's not all particularly edifying.
No, that's right.
But they are real phenomenon, and so I despair sometimes. I mean, you said a few minutes ago it's different now than it was back in 1983. You bet it is.
Yeah.
And I thoroughly enjoyed the time that I was in politics for those 28 years. But when I look at what some of my, who were previously my colleagues have to endure today, I'm not so sure that I'm sorry that I'm away from it now.
No, that's one thing that scares me.
Yeah.
Sure.
No, if someone today is thinking about getting into politics, they've got to be very aware of those kinds of potentials.
But also the team around them, because they need to have someone else post for them.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
That person, if they don't post correctly,
yeah,
they get roasted. That person, they just get fired, but you can replace them. But
everything, accountability, or the buck always stops at the candidate's desk.
Exactly, yeah.
Absolutely, no question about it.
Yeah.
There's no point in trying to, clean up the damage afterwards, because it's done.
It's done, yeah. Even if you say sorry 1,000 times, they just get you harder.
Doesn't
I actually
matter.
think not saying sorry seems to work better for people. But
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting trend today that as people are, outed, so to speak, the blubbering and the saying sorry that goes on sometimes is itself not very edifying either.
Yeah.
It's pathetic.
Yeah.
It really is. And sometimes you see people that I would consider have, maybe a slip of the tongue at worst, but in today's context, for example, people aren't necessarily exposing themselves as being racist or anything like that, but if they just have stated something in a way that was maybe okay 5 years ago, today not, well, all of a sudden they're being thrown off of boards and they're being excommunicated all around.
everything, yeah.
It's brutal to watch that.
Yeah, that's crazy.
I mean, just a recent example was Stockwell Day,
Okay.
who basically made the point that he didn't think Canada was a racist society.
That's right. Yeah, I did see that.
And, well, I personally don't believe that that's a remarkable statement.
Yeah.
Do we have racism in Canada? Yes, we do. But are we a racist society? No, I don't think so. I think that's, just a few steps too far to say that. So Stockwell Day offers up that opinion. Firestorm ensues, and he's fired left, right, and center. He's done. He's finished.
Yeah.
He's roadkill.
That's wild. So I wasn't going to talk about this, but now that we're talking about it, let's go there. So let's say you're an employer, and you there's two types of people you can hire: blue people and orange people. And every time you hire a blue person, someone that's blue skin, they work really well, work hard, and you're super happy with them. And every time you hire someone with orange skin, they cheat on you and they don't work hard, and they mess things up. Mm-hmm. You have a new job opening, you put out an ad, you have two people apply. One's blue, one's orange. You're going to hire the blue guy.
Yep.
Is that racist?
No, I think that's an appropriate use of discrimination. To live is to discriminate every day.
Yeah.
I discriminate as to what I have for breakfast in the morning.
Yeah.
And I discriminate in terms of who I prefer to work with.
Yeah. But you would say the media would view that as racism.
Of course they would.
Yeah.
Yes, I know that's the trend.
Yeah.
And I think they've gotten way, way, way beyond what is normal, and they've gotten way outside of how people live their ordinary, everyday lives.
Yeah. Because for example, the Dutch community that we're a part of, or that are immigrated from 30, 40 years ago, are known for being super cheap. Or some of them are.
In some cases, careful with the dollar.
Which is can have good things and bad things associated with it. But
Sure.
So if someone views me right away because I say I'm Dutch, I mean that just. I'm stuck with that, but that doesn't mean I don't think they view me less. They just have to go off of that because that's their past experience.
All peoples have their characteristics.
Yeah.
And I think it's folly to try to, suggest that isn't so. That doesn't mean that you have to like someone more or less as a result. Mm-hmm. But there's this mob mentality nowadays.
Yeah.
Media defines often what is acceptable or what is not acceptable, or the progressive groups decide what's acceptable or not acceptable, and then a major groupthink kind of seems to take hold. And if you're not part of that, then you're written off as being a knuckle dragger or something like that. An area of public discussion and debate that I'm quite interested in is the matter of climate change, for example.
Yeah.
And I happen to be in a camp that's being referred to often as being skeptical.
Yeah.
I once thought that for one to be skeptical was a good thing.
Yeah.
In lots of areas of life.
Yeah.
But in the case of climate, if you're skeptical and if you want to discuss and debate and examine, no. You have to accept the established curriculum that they've laid out for you.
That's right.
And believe accordingly. Otherwise, you're a denier.
Yeah. Or worse.
Yeah. And that's simply pathetic.
Yeah.
It's awful that we've come to that point.
It turns off the conversation.
Well, it turns off the conversation, and it is an important conversation to have.
Yeah.
Because some of these areas of public policy, and there's many, have profound impact on our mutual welfare going forward.
Yeah.
On a social level, at a moral level, at an economic level, and yet it's almost taboo to be allowed to have that discussion.
Yes. So I want to dive into that, because it was one of the biggest reasons I wanted to have you on was talk about climate change, because
Sure.
I'm not very educated on it, and I just hear the left and the right side, and I'm kind of confused. So, but before we go there, what is I guess your worldview based on? Like, what is your foundation? Maybe how you grew up. Like, what is the basis of what you believe, and that shaped kind of where you are today?
Yeah, well, I'm not even sure that in the early years when I was first in politics, I actually gave that a lot of thought. I got involved in municipal politics, right? So let's back up a little bit. Before that, I was born right here in Chilliwack. My parents had arrived here from Holland just the year before. They joined what was then a small group of people, went to church on Sundays, the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a Calvinist organization, and so I went to church with my parents all of those years. I still belong to that same church, which is Calvinist, which is conservative in its worldview, and that I think sort of informs my basic view of the world. Whether it's to do with social issues or economic issues or ethical issues, in the first number of years being involved in municipal politics, for the first 3 years I was a councillor, I saw myself being there as helping to build up the community, and where there was growth, to make it happen in a way that was acceptable to the people already here, making sure there was good economic development that would accompany that, so people could find jobs in the community. But as you go, day to day, month to month, and as you're making decisions, obviously, and this goes for anybody, your decisions are informed by who you are, what you've come to believe in over the years. You're not going to make a socialist out of a free enterpriser very easily. And you're not going to make a social progressive out of a social conservative very easily. Some people do move around a little bit, but I do find that that's usually for reasons of getting ahead politically and that kind of thing. And so political parties themselves have shifted too over time. 100 years ago, the Liberal Party of Canada was a totally different creature than it is today. It was small L liberal. Today it is
Trudeau less liberal.
He definitely
he wouldn't have been in that party.
He's Trudeau is, autocratic in many ways, in that, he will determine on how you will think, or at least how you will vote on
Yeah.
social issues.
Yeah.
It's the most anti-democratic thing you could imagine. I can't imagine how somebody purports to say to someone else, and this is how you must vote on that thing that is, near and dear to you, and
Yeah.
that, you've actually supported all of your life, doesn't matter. Now, for political expediency, this is the position you'll take. That's corrupt.
Yeah.
That is just wrong.
Yeah.
And anyway, so parties change over time, and so, we've seen. I think some of these federal parties have changed considerably just in the last generation.
Yeah. Very much so.
And you see that in over the longer time horizon in the United States, for example. The Democratic Party were the party of slavery back until the 1860s.
Yeah.
Today, they would have you believe that they're anything but.
That's right.
Right? So, there's been a lot of changes like that, too. And it's difficult sometimes to, keep your finger on exactly
where it's moving.
Who's where. And I've often made the point that political ideology is not a straight line or a straight line continuum from left to right. I think the thing is actually circular.
Yeah.
Where the extremes kind of meet, and there's a bit of an overlap there.
Yeah.
So
back to yourself on the Judeo-Christian values.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you grew up, and did you as a young person going into politics later on in late 20s, early 30s?
I was 31 when I was first elected.
So was that on the forefront of your mind, like the Christianity side, or was that something more just like there was a basis you grew up with, and those are your building blocks? Or
it defined who I was, back then. I mean, I'd had a few other minor community involvements at the time. I came from the agricultural community as well, so I sat on a couple of boards, so people knew who I was. So, back then you didn't explicitly, particularly on municipal issues, you didn't run explicitly on, a Christian platform or anything like that. But, again, there was no confusion about that. Nobody confused me for being, a left-wing atheist. Not at all.
Yeah.
And inherently, the issues that were on the table municipally weren't necessarily those that engaged one's ideology too much anyway.
Yeah.
Right? Particularly not then. That's changed a bit too lately, where some of these issues are filtering down to the local level, because the progressive movement has learned very well that if they can move their demands around and engage as many of these elected bodies as possible, they're going to knock down a few totems. And as they keep doing that, there's a momentum that builds from that.
It keeps going.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so climate change. I'll give you a little rundown how I feel about it and what I think about it, and then we can start talking about it. So I'm always confused by a few things. First of all, that it seems to be a partisan issue. So as a Christian myself, I think we should take care of the world around us, recycle, just be good stewards of the world that we live in, that God has put us in. But it seems to be, from what I read in the media and stuff like that, which of course is skewed, that the Liberals want everything to be basically safe, everything to be safe, that the world's falling apart, that we can't do oil anymore, everything has to be green, super extreme the other side. And it seems the Conservatives are either saying nothing because they're scared of the mob mentality, or they're saying, no, anything can go. As much economic development as possible. It doesn't matter how much we ruin the environment, that kind of thing, which doesn't seem like a very conservative. When I think conservative, I often think Christian, which maybe is not always the case. Conservative is more on economic things, and it seems like the Conservative Party anyways, and the Republican Party is going more libertarian than it is really conservative. But why is that? Why does it seem to be such a partisan issue?
I'm not even sure it is that partisan, because in my moments of despair, I see far too many, left or right, chasing this green utopia. Let me say, first of all, I agree with you. We have an obligation, all of us, to be good stewards of the environment.
Yeah.
Environmental irresponsibility, I don't think there's any need for it, first of all. And secondly, I think it's just not appropriate. If you look at it from a religious point of view, it's pretty clear that we have that obligation to look after the earth well.
Yeah.
Do accidents and unfortunate things happen? Yes, they do, which then gives us obviously the mandate to make sure we clean it up. And we have lots of examples of that through history as well, where the London fogs of the mid 20th century, for example, where people were literally dying in the street. Well, they figured it out, and today that's just not a phenomenon anymore.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the London fogs.
Well, they burn so much coal
Okay.
that they would actually make today's Beijing look relatively clean.
Wow.
And their air quality was horrible.
Okay.
Anyway, so I take that as a given. We have an obligation to look after the environment well, and where we mess up is fix it, clean it up, and make sure it doesn't happen again.
Yeah.
But the environmental movement, as we see it today, has moved well beyond that.
Okay.
You get this notion, for example, of a precautionary principle, which I've often heard that invoked, that we'd better not do this right now, until we know absolutely everything there is to know about it. And even then, maybe we shouldn't do it just in case something bad might happen. I've often said irreverently, well, then I better stay in bed in the morning for fear something bad might happen if I venture out of bed.
Yeah.
But that precautionary principle has, I tell you, snuffed an awful lot of opportunity that otherwise might have been able to develop into something quite beneficial.
Yeah.
So there is that. The whole notion, of course, of climate change used to be called global warming at one point until, that sort of phrase didn't quite capture it very conveniently when we saw a plateauing of Earth temperatures in the last 20 years. So then they made it climate change. But it got its genesis, I guess, more or less, starting in and around 1980, thereabouts. In the 1970s, interestingly, there was a lot of concern about global cooling. There was a period
that was globally, or that was in Canada?
Globally.
Okay.
Globally. There was pictures on the front of Time magazine, for example, about lots of icicles and things like that.
Polar bears with no water to swim in, rather than no ice to have.
No, it was talked about in the 70s. We're entering into perhaps a little ice age, or that kind of thing. Then the 80s came along, and that period of cooling stopped, and there was actually a little bit of warming that went on until the late 90s. So then there was one influential individual in particular. It was a Canadian by the name of Maurice Strong, who was hired by the UN and was the main mover and shaker behind the Rio conference in 1992. And it was at that point as well, or just a few years before that, that the International Panel on Climate Change was formed. So now you had a real institutionalization of the climate change agenda, and with Maurice Strong very deliberately pushing it hard. And involving people like Gro Harlem Brundtland from the Scandinavian countries and others like that who had some standing in diplomatic and political circles. And at the same time, as we moved further into the 90s, you had people like Al Gore, who was at that point the vice president of the United States, was a great champion for the global warming agenda.
Yeah.
So it gained some traction, and the IPCC put out some reports from time to time, and they did become increasingly alarmist, although they were interestingly always kind of couched in wording that said, well, we're not really sure, but this is what we think is happening, and the probability is whatever.
Yes, yeah. What do you think? Was there ever like a political motivation to have this view even in the beginning? Because generally it's like if you have a certain view, you get more votes. That's why politicians go that, like, why Al Gore went that route? Does he actually deeply care about the world? Because I was not sure about someone like carries that much, that has that much power. Like, I don't think.
Well, if I can put it perhaps in a slightly larger context, so around the end of the 80s, the early 90s, it was pretty clear that communism was collapsing around the world, with perhaps a few exceptions like China. But certainly, the Soviet Union was clapped out; it was gone.
Yeah.
A lot of the communist experiments in Africa and Central America were falling apart, and so the international left, if I can call it that, found itself without any hobby horses to ride. They discovered pretty quickly that if they could embrace this concern about climate change,
Yeah.
that for them this could be a pretty neat Trojan horse. And I still use that analogy very much today.
So
it is
consciously a Trojan horse.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. And when you look at some of the objectives, some of the measures that they would have us adopt to deal with climate change, it is very much about equalization of everything and to a certain degree impoverishing everyone, limiting their economic opportunities, and being far more regulatory and prescriptive in nature. In other words, less individual freedom.
Yeah.
That's very much a hallmark of the usual recommendations that are promoted by these people. So, and in the Canadian political context, it didn't have too much traction, I don't think, in political circles until.
So the old Trudeau wasn't bringing this up when he was in power?
No.
Okay.
No, it was just not an issue at all. I mean, Trudeau Sr. left office in 1984 or 1983. And, we had just come out of that period of the potential global cooling.
Yeah.
So no, it didn't feature as an issue. Then Mulroney became prime minister, and his signature thing was the ozone hole.
Oh yeah.
And so he was able to grab that, and eventually they signed the Montreal protocols around that, and now everybody's taking credit for the ozone hole, being closed. I haven't studied that one deeply enough to know whether there actually was a hole, or if there is, was it unusual?
Yeah.
Don't know. All I know is that we're using different freons nowadays than we did then, because it was posited that the release of that freon type of material,
which isn't necessarily a bad thing, right?
No, that's right. And Mulroney in his day was also concerned about acid rain in certain parts of North America, and there was some kind of a bilateral agreement between the States and Canada on that one as well. So those may have been good things, but in those years you did not hear about global warming or climate change as being a particular preoccupation.
So back then, it also wasn't the Conservatives that thought the ozone discussion is a bunch of hogwash, and Liberals really wanted to talk about it. It was more just both sides. We agreed that.
Yeah, there was a lot of agreement there, and of course it was Mulroney and the Conservatives that were actually addressing those issues.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different now. I find that those who are most interested in addressing climate change, or let me put it this way, the more they are on the left of the political spectrum, the more likely they are to be, ardently in favor of action to do with climate. The more to the right they are, the less likely they are to be as concerned that it's a problem and an issue that needs to be addressed.
And do you know the root of that? Why that is?
I don't know that. It's hard to say why that is. I mean, on the right, you'll normally see more skepticism around regulation and limitations of people's freedoms and things like that, which, on the left, they've obviously always
done
more.
the opposite. Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
would make sense, yeah.
Yeah, so anyway, I can recall so clearly that it was a cabinet meeting I was in 2006, where suddenly the Premier announced, before you go, guys, one more thing I'd like to discuss briefly, and that was we were going to go, all in on a climate agenda. And everybody kind of looked around and said, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
Hadn't run on it in 2005. We certainly hadn't done that. And I put my hand up and I said, Premier, where'd that come from? I said, this is something I've actually kept an eye on for many years. And now I think we're being encouraged to join the other lemmings that are heading over the cliff.
Yeah.
That comment wasn't well received, but in any event.
Did you have a good relationship with the Premier?
With Premier Campbell, yeah, not too bad. We got along okay. I served with Premier Christy Clark as well for a couple of years. She was a little bit more user-friendly, I'd have to say.
Okay.
And with Gordon Campbell, if you weren't on the same wavelength as him on certain issues, then pretty quickly you found yourself sort of on the outside looking in.
Interesting.
That was just a reality. But he, for whatever reason, and it still perplexes me to this day, why all of a sudden he became a climate change evangelist. And he dug in deep. He really did. He was way out there where almost no Canadian politician had gone to that point.
When you say climate evangelist, what do you mean? Like that they're saying that the whole world's warming up and that we're going to have no civilization in a couple of years? Or like what is the message actually that's being put out that you disagree with so much?
Well, it was just that the increasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was a problem. It was going to fry the earth, and we were going to limit our children and our grandchildren's future as a result, make the planet, practically uninhabitable.
Yeah. And you would say that's completely hogwash. It's just not.
I would be the first to say the climate has always changed.
Okay.
Nothing's new there. We have all kinds of historical evidence of, major shifts in climate.
So you believe in climate change?
Yeah, exactly.
But just not what they did. How
there is no question that, for example, 1,000 years ago, there was what was called the medieval warm period. And the temperatures then were higher than they are today. What caused that? I don't know.
Yeah.
But I doubt that it was carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
And then, we had a gradual cooling over time, and then you got into the 1600s, for example, and it was very cold. If you read some of the accounts of the early Canadian history, even on the West Coast here, I wouldn't have wanted to live here then.
Yeah.
It was cold, clammy, and miserable.
Yeah.
Thankfully, it's warmed up a little bit again.
Yeah.
People forget, if you read the science, a warmer environment is much more benign for people than a colder environment. We lose many more people every year to freezing to death than it being too hot.
Yeah.
That's still the case today.
Yeah.
So
when you say the science, like where is that science? Because for example, preparing for this interview, I did a little bit of research on climate change, those kind of things, and so you Google this, but there's very little that speaks about the I guess the side that doesn't believe in climate change so much that it's happening, and it's basically all the other side. So for people listening, like where did you, when you say the science, where is that based on?
Well, the first thing to say is this, that because the public, the broad sweep of the so-called scientific community is very much pushing the climate change agenda, it is indeed difficult to find the dissenting voices and where they are. And of course, your average search engine today isn't going to take you to the skeptical point of view. That's just not it. I mean, Google and all of the others, they're themselves very invested in this theory being, the way it is.
Yep.
So you have to dig a little bit. You got to read a little bit. Over the years, I've found a great many very good books and research materials. I've been in touch with a lot of good scientists, and had some great discussions with them. You get a guy like Dr. Roy Spencer. He's down in Atlanta, and he basically runs all of the weather satellites in the United States. He's written a few books, and satellite observations are extremely accurate.
Yeah.
And they show very little trend whatsoever. Since 1979, when those satellites first went into service.
Yeah.
And there's many other good people out there, and So, I've been reading these many authors for a great deal of time. There's also, there was a Dr. Bill Robinson, I believe his name was. He was concerned about, the slant of debate around climate change. So he started up a petition of a bunch of scientists who basically said, yes, the climate changes, but we don't believe that CO2 has any measurable effect on that climate change. It was signed by over 30,000 American scientists, a third of which have a PhD.
Yeah.
Now, I've brought that up numerous times, of course, and immediately that gets poo-pooed. And if you Google it, you'll find somebody like the no fracking consensus type of group that will, crap all over the Oregon petition, as it's called. But I've talked to some of these guys that signed this thing, and they're genuine. They're real people. They're good scientists.
Yeah.
And they've simply said, yeah, the climate changes, and I believe that as well, from time to time and, century to century. But the whole premise today is it's caused by carbon dioxide, a little bit more or a little bit less.
Yeah. Is there money in believing that climate change is really happening? And the reason I ask that because, for example, if you take sugar in the States, I think Michelle Obama, when when her husband came into office, she started this health thing, and so she wanted to raise awareness in schools that people to eat more healthy, and so she was looking for sponsors. So Coca-Cola became this huge sponsor.
Yep.
Which is interesting because they pump out a lot of sugar there.
They sure do.
But then they have some say in how this happens, right?
Yep.
So why isn't that the oil companies and all these companies that are really focused on energy that some people view as not as clean, how come they weren't pushing the politicians left or right to favor their view more? How come it still seems to be so incredibly forceful on the one side? 97% of scientists, they say. I know you disagree with that, but yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just let me deal for a minute with that 97% figure. That's the most contrived piece of information ever. I believe it was the IPCC that wanted to do a survey of the scientific community. And as is often the case, if you send out 100 questionnaires, you might get 20 back.
Yeah.
And in that particular case, they got back actually a fairly small percentage. And of that small percentage, some said, I have no opinion. So those were put aside. And others said, oh, yes, we're all on board. Yeah. And it was of a group of many, many thousands of scientists who were initially involved, only a few responded. And of that very small response, 97% said, yes, we believe that there is global warming. Even then, they didn't say it's caused by carbon dioxide or anything like that. They didn't.
They just admitted it was changing, but they didn't give the cause.
Exactly. So their responses were manipulated.
Yeah.
And so the 97% thing is a very much contrived figure, but it's been bandied around all over the place. Barack Obama used it a lot.
Yeah.
And so it actually is a piece of nonsense. So you say, why the momentum behind it? Well, there's money to be made. When you look at all of these wind farms, all of these solar farms, the political class has found it, pretty sexy to give out some pretty significant grants. And more and more, the university and the research community are co-opted as well, because another major impact are the various foundations in the United States: the Rockefeller Foundation, the Moore Foundation, the Packard Foundation.
Yeah.
They're huge. They have a lot of money to give away.
Yeah.
And the boards of these foundations have set them off in a totally different direction from their first conception. So there's a lot of money available.
Yeah.
And if you're a scientific climate researcher at a university, if you want your career to go somewhere, you'd better sign on with the current theories to do with climate change. Otherwise, I guarantee you,
You're not going to go anywhere.
you're going nowhere. And you'll find some of these professors, they're only starting to speak out after they've retired from their university. Judith Curry would be probably one of the more recent examples. Judith Curry's always been very good, but now that she's freed of her university connection,
A lot more open.
she's much more open, and so those people can be very informative. So it's so many people are captured that way, and then of course if there's going to be a major switch. A re-engineering of our economies and our society, which is what these people openly talk about. You get in front of that a little bit, and Al Gore is really good at that. If we're going to have carbon trading, for example, well, pretty soon folks have this idea that's going to be kind of a stock exchange in carbon credits. There's been numerous scams already in Europe and even here in BC to do with that. But money is made.
So
Big money
money is a driver.
It is a driver for, I won't say in all cases, but certainly it is the motivator for many of them to stay on track.
Yeah. So we all need energy. Why not switch to solar energy, hydro, wind farms? We both have ancestors in Holland. Wind farms were around for a super long time there. That's how the energy was created and stuff like that. We said earlier that we want to take care of the environment around us. Why not leave coal, leave oil, and go to those cleaner ways of producing energy?
Yeah, the first thing you have to establish is that no matter the source of energy, they all have some kind of external impact. If it's nuclear we're talking about, there's the disposal of the waste.
Yeah.
If it's wind power we're talking about, those big windmills don't just happen. They're not made out of pixie dust. That's a major industrial enterprise to make those huge blades. And then each one of the bases for each of those windmills takes 800 cubic yards of concrete. Often in very inaccessible places. So, the ground disturbance and everything else that needs to happen to put up one of those towers is very significant.
Yeah.
And then there's also the question of reliability. And that's huge. When you want the light on in a room, you flick the switch and you expect that light to come on.
Yeah.
Not a flickering light.
Yeah.
No, you want that light on. And that's just for a light. If you're running an electric motor of some kind, it absolutely has to have stable power.
Yeah.
Or you'll blow it up.
Yeah.
So our entire society, our entire economy is based on steady and reliable and also basically affordable energy as well. And the track record so far has been that wind power and solar power, to the extent that it's out there, and it's only a minuscule amount at this point, generally doesn't happen without subsidization by government. So it's hard sometimes to compare apples and apples with the cost of fossil fuel derived power versus solar derived power.
Yeah.
But they are both sources of energy, solar and wind, that are not reliable enough. Now there are countries like Germany that's really put its pedal to the metal and tried their very best to put as much of their economy on renewable energy as possible. But interestingly, at the very same time they're doing that, they're building new coal-fired plants because they have to have that backup in case the wind goes down. They need an almost instant source of power to steady the grid.
Yeah.
And that's an additional cost.
Yeah.
That if you weren't building, what you're doing is you're building redundancy that isn't necessary in many of the other systems that we've grown up with. Natural gas is another great fuel that can be used to generate electricity. We burn natural gas today in a way that almost produces no emissions whatsoever,
Yeah.
other than a little carbon dioxide.
Yeah.
I'll grant you that. Nuclear power, I think we're going to see some evolution in nuclear power. The huge plants that we've seen in the past are maybe a thing of the past, and we're going to see more modular, scaled-down versions of nuclear plants that are created in a factory somewhere and then transported to close to the location where that electricity is needed.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about that nowadays, and I think that's something that may well be very much a part of the future. Other than that, once the uranium has been mined and the plant put together, those things run and run and run and run with no emissions, no pollution at all. There's been a couple of bad accidents. Fukushima was one, and
they're still dealing with that, I think.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And the moral of that story was, don't build one of those right at the seaside in an earthquake zone.
Yeah.
You're might have trouble that way.
Yeah.
And of course the Russian plant that blew up in the 80s, the shoddy construction is what got them.
Yeah.
But other than that, those are the only two, significant examples. A few minor glitches here and there, but those are the only two significant examples. And I would argue that in both cases, they've more or less overcome them, the challenges that those presented, without a long-term detrimental effect on the environment. Increasingly, when you go back to the start of the industrial age, people simply get better and better and better at what they do. Find out new things and use materials in different ways, much less intrusive on the environment.
Yeah.
That's been the story of our economic and environmental progress over the last several hundred years. So let's keep that going. And let's not be so focused on these so-called renewables, which economically are probably not very productive, and environmentally may well be easily as destructive as what we're trying to replace. The other thing about the wind farms is, of course, the toll that they take on avian life, on eagles and owls and bats and birds of all kinds.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a slaughterhouse out there in a big wind farm.
Yeah, so explain that, because I see your posts on Facebook about that, and I had no idea until you posted about it, because I definitely didn't read it in CNN or Fox News even. So
No, it's seldom commented on, but in these large wind farms, what they do is they have a crew that's on steadily to go out first thing in the morning and clean up any dead birds.
Wow.
When you have these large wind farms in, some places in California and whatnot, where they have, the eagle soaring and all that kind of thing. The golden eagle is one that gets victimized quite a bit.
Yeah.
That's really too bad as far as I'm concerned. Bats seem to have a particular predisposition to just get sucked into these things.
So would you say there's no room for wind energy, or do you just say, we just need to control it more?
I think it's a waste of time.
Okay.
I really do.
So even in Holland, where they've had it used it for hundreds of years?
Well, they used it in a different way. The windmills that they had back in the 15, 16, 1700s and were using at that time, that was to grind their grain.
Yeah.
It wasn't to produce electricity.
Yeah.
It was to run the mill.
Mm-hmm.
And that's quite something different. If it was a quiet afternoon, there was no wind blowing, well, he just didn't grind any flour that day.
Yeah.
Whereas, with these modern windmills, they've got to turn, or you don't have electricity. And when you don't have electricity, our society doesn't work very well. And the other thing that always has to be kept in mind, and sometimes we do a very poor job of this, you have to look at the life cycle environmental costs of some of these things. Some of the rare metals and things like that go into even electric batteries, and certainly into the guts of a wind farm. These things are rare to start with, involve a lot of manufacturing. A lot of transportation. Like I say, every one of those windmills, 800 cubic meters of concrete. Any idea how much that is?
Yeah, I don't know.
And the manufacture of cement is widely held as being something that's quite polluting.
Yeah.
I think it's important to bring all of those costs into the equation so that we can have a real apples to apples comparison.
Yeah.
Then you establish a wind farm, you come along 20 years later, probably the thing is at the end of its life
Yeah.
and needs to be either completely retooled or even taken down
Yeah.
in some cases. So, whereas, a country like France has been on nuclear power, 70% of their power comes from nuclear, been running away since, I think, the 1950s when most of that was built. No problems.
Still going hard, yeah.
Just as reliable as it was on day one.
What about electric vehicles? How do you feel about that?
Electric vehicles, fine. I would argue for no subsidization.
Okay.
And I also would argue for no subsidization of the oil industry either. Let each stand on their own economic merits.
Full capitalization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you look at electric vehicles, they've come a long ways. Elon Musk is a remarkable fellow.
Yep.
He's got the guts and the get up and go that few people have.
Yep.
They're producing these Teslas. You see more of them on the road every day.
Yep.
I don't think that they might be the answer in all cases. I still think that there's an application of fuel cell technology that might be more beneficial in the case of transport, for example.
Yep.
Because these batteries weigh a ton,
Yeah,
more in the case of a transport truck.
Yeah.
I'm wide open to all of these technologies because there are cleaner and better ways of doing things. As a kid growing up here in the Fraser Valley in the 50s and 60s, I remember some of the horrible air pollution we used to have, and that was comprised of a number of things. It was dirty exhaust coming out of everybody's car.
Yeah.
When I drive behind a vintage car today, I can smell it.
Yeah.
They smell different. They smell.
So you'd say that innovation is good then? You like, for how example China has it, where you can't see, you're 20th story of a high rise and you can't see
That's right. But China has two problems. First of all, it's all the emissions. And I mean, I've been in Beijing and you see these power plants and they have a very tall chimney.
Yeah.
Maybe 250 feet up there, and the soot just barely falls out of the top and then falls back down again, so that everybody can breathe it. So they have an old infrastructure like that. They don't have, by any stretch of the imagination, the best technology for running these old electrical generating plants. So that's one problem. The other problem they have is a lot of particulate matter, and you hear of those dust storms once in a while in China that are really problematic. And of course, that's a natural phenomenon. They're not going to do anything about. But when you combine, the particulate that comes from improperly burning coal and oil and those other things, and you marry that up with particulate matter, as in the case of that fine sand, then you've really got a pea soup. We used to have that in the Fraser Valley here when back in the day there were a lot of those beehive burners related to sawmills along the north shore of the Fraser River all the way out to Vancouver.
Yeah.
There was a bunch of them. And they were, the catalyst for a lot of the air pollution that we had here at the time. And as those things disappeared, and as we got rid of the lead in gasoline, and as we got rid of the pollutants in car exhausts generally, one of the things that we noticed right away is that we had far fewer foggy days. We used to have some real pea soup fog that was, directly related to all that pollution.
So is that not driven though by government regulation saying, hey, if you have this plant, it needs to be so clean, like so few particles coming out, and if you are a car manufacturer, you need to have the emissions need to be so low, which is government driven.
Yep.
So would you be are you in favor of those kind of things then?
There is a place for government to regulate.
Okay.
But it is to set standards, and then to back off, and then allow the private sector to achieve those standards, each in their own best competitive way. May the best idea win, I always say.
Yeah.
So it's not for government to ordain it must be a Tesla or it must be, a fuel cell.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, they might both have an application.
Yeah.
Today we see too much of that tendency for government to manipulate the results. They shouldn't do that. They should come address themselves to what is an acceptable standard that we should achieve.
Yeah.
That isn't extremist, like California has been a little bit guilty of that, trying to get to a point where, it's almost impossible to build an internal combustion engine of any kind with the standards that they have set. And Germany might be on the cusp of driving the automobile industry out of its country.
Which would be interesting. That's what they're a big part of their history.
Absolutely. But I think car makers in Germany are being faced with performance demands that would have them move out and try to
or cheat like they did with Volkswagen.
Well, yeah, that was a direct result of that.
Yeah.
And just to change gears here a little bit, the Boeing Max 8, the genesis of that issue was, to become more fuel efficient to reach the targets that had been established by, international agencies.
Yeah.
And so they designed a plane that wouldn't fly very well, and 2 of them fell out of the sky.
Yeah. So I guess the regulation that you are for, I guess there's differences on how tight. I mean, you don't believe in the California standard, but you also don't believe in the Beijing standard.
Exactly.
So there's an in-between there. So I guess that's just a discussion that we need to have on where that standard is.
That's right. Absolutely. And then, I'm a pretty optimistic guy. I know that the brain power is out there to do a lot of very, very good things. When it becomes a competitive value, to be the best in the industry, well, I tell you, the financial incentives are very significant.
Yeah.
So it's, government's approach, though, is extremely important. And if it wants to start manipulating, and too often what governments do is they'll set a standard one day and they'll back off another day and set another standard another day, which is extremely bewildering for those who are trying to respond to those standards. Societies generally, and certainly business in particular, needs certainty. When that certainty is provided, you can even be pushing the envelope a little bit, but so long as it's concrete and it's clear,
you know what to expect.
People will get there.
Yeah. And you see that in the oil industry too, with everyone leaving out of Canada when Trudeau got in, not because anything changed right away, but because of the uncertainty.
Well, that's right, exactly. I mean, are you seriously going to advance an application for a pipeline in Canada today? Not a chance.
Yeah.
Not a chance. But the Americans will build them, and they'll, exploit their oil industry. They got lots and lots of oil, and Canada will be left behind. And what the other thing, of course, that we will leave behind is all of the economic benefit
For that,
that flows from the thing. There's no, the world uses 100 million barrels of oil per day. You can wish this, that, and the next thing. Tomorrow we're going to use 100 million barrels of oil. That's just the reality. And 10 years from now, we will still be using at least 100 million barrels of oil. So let's get used to it already. But let's do it in a way that is most environmentally responsible.
Yeah.
It's possible to do that. When governments try to manipulate too much, what happens? No pipeline? Okay, let's put it on a train. And then the trail derails.
Yeah, that's no better. Yeah.
Derails and makes a big mess. So, people who are familiar with how you move things around see no problem with putting oil in a pipeline.
One of the safest ways.
It's one of the safest ways to do that.
Yeah.
It really is.
You have this young person that's traveling the world now, Greta Thunberg. Thunberg it is.
Yeah.
So she's advocating for things like don't run your AC at home. Those kind of things about losing less energy to things saving the world that way. Thoughts on that?
That's fine. If Greta, wants to turn her air conditioning off most days of the year, I have no problem with that. It's her own personal choice. But let me make my personal choices as well. And by the way, demand that I pay the appropriate price for that.
Yeah.
For sure. But, Greta Thunberg, unfortunately, I think she's been badly manipulated by a few people. If there isn't some George Soros money in there, I'd be awfully surprised.
Yeah.
So she's a, fetching young girl, and the next thing you know, she's at the United Nations scolding people. How dare you? I mean, those are galvanizing moments for sure. But based on what exactly? It's just based on a fad.
Yeah.
And I wish her no ill, but I wish that people like her would stop trying to drive the world in a direction that's destructive for everybody.
But it's also, I guess, not her so much, but it's the media capturing onto that and and
The media
pushing it out there.
The media love those kinds of things.
Almost like a puppet.
And the other thing that's interesting is how quickly somebody like that gets dropped. The next best thing comes along that captivates people. In this case, it was probably the coronavirus and Greta who. The world's a cruel place that way.
Yeah.
You're in the limelight one day and you're yesterday's kid the next.
Yeah.
That's also a reality.
Yeah.
And of course, she was engaged when she was very young. And one thing I've seen with quite a few of these young superstars over time is that they're an item in their very youth, but afterwards are never heard from again. In some cases, they've had their lives quite destroyed by the fame and fortune and all that kind of thing, which is pretty sad as well. But it can be a very fleeting thing. But from society's perspective, she was pushing hard at this agenda of global warming and globalization too. By the way, is part of that, because what is often seen as being the appropriate regulatory response to climate change is global regulation by global regulatory bodies.
So it's in their best interest.
Very much a feature of what goes on. Of course, Europe tends to lead the way a little bit on that because they've seen their own, I would say, small-scale version of globalization, which is the European Union, where the member countries have essentially given up any claim to sovereignty in favor of the larger construct called the European Union. And of course, there's an awful lot of regulation of the lives of Europeans today that is courtesy of the European Union, not particularly of the country of which they are resident.
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard an interview by Nigel Farage.
Yes.
And when he got into the European Union in that parliament there, he had a bunch of colleagues that were very against making it one big body.
Right.
But then when they started getting these fancy lunches every single day and these nice cocktail dinners and parties and stuff like that, then all of a sudden they slowly started changing because the power and the fame came along with it.
Yeah,
which I guess is pretty...
And money.
Yeah.
And again, there's a fellow in the European Parliament. He's a Belgian by the name of Guy Verhofstadt. Center left.
Yeah.
But a huge champion of this concept of a European Union being seen as the equivalent of the United States of America. It's interesting to me that they would tend to want to emulate the United States of America by creating the United States of Europe. They would resist any allegation like that, but yet that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
27, I guess now 27 countries minus Great Britain, so I think Europeans are in the process of losing a lot of their rights to a body that is largely appointed and not elected. I know they have a European Parliament, but the percentages of the various populations that get involved in those elections is very small. And the real power brokers in the European Union are people who are appointed.
Yeah.
And so it's we're far afield here, but the folks living in Europe, I think, are facing a future that they maybe hadn't expected or bargained for.
Yeah, interesting. I want to sort of shift gears here a little bit and spend a little bit of time talking about what's going on in the States, especially the Trump world. I remember talking to you back in 2016 before he was elected, before you thought he was going to get elected. And now viewing, as we reach November, the new elections and stuff like that, how have you viewed his presidency? How do you view him as a leader? Are you all in? Is it just a few good things you think he's doing? What are your thoughts on?
Yeah, well, in 2016, what I actually said was, and I posted on social media, if I was an American, I wouldn't vote for either. I would take advantage of the provision they have where you can write in a candidate,
Yep.
and I probably would have written in Mike Pence.
Yeah.
But I also predicted that Trump would win. And I remember having lunch the day before the American election with a lawyer in Vancouver, and obviously we got discussing the election the next day.
Yeah.
And I said, I think Trump's going to win this thing. And he says, "You're off your meds or something." I said, "Well, look at this." I said, when you watch this whole campaign that it played out between him and Hillary, what I started to sense was that a lot of people who were going to vote for Trump weren't saying so. When a pollster called, they would say undecided, or they would say I'm voting for Hillary, and they went in the voting booth and they voted for Trump. And in retrospect, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah.
So Trump got elected. I think Trump. And I've used this phrase before. He's an inelegant exemplar in terms of being president of the United States. He's somewhat rude, sometimes crude, but does enough good things that, on balance, he's having some success. I give him great marks for guts and for following through on certain key commitments. Out of the Paris Climate Accords, done.
Yeah.
Draining the swamp, he's working on it.
Yeah.
He presented a list of 25 potential judges. That's what he appointed from. So it's been a chaotic presidency. Not all his fault, though, because the other reality is that the Democrats never quit campaigning against him the night of the election. They just kept going. And, the deep state got involved through the FBI and other agencies. That's now really clear.
Yeah.
Americans in particular, and even residents of other countries, need to pay attention to this. When state agencies start to become weaponized for political reasons, you're on a very bad track.
Yeah.
And that happened, and it resulted in a lot of intimidation of Trump government officials. It resulted in the Mueller investigation.
Yeah.
It resulted in so many really negative things. I mean, in spite of all of that, you got to give Trump some credit for keeping his eye more or less on the ball and getting a whole bunch of things done.
So what about people like David Mathis, John Bolton, high profile, well-respected Republicans that have now said, hey, he's not a legitimate leader, he doesn't know what he's doing, he's fly by night, that kind of stuff.
Money is a great motivator, ain't it? Bolton, guess what? He's got a book to sell.
Yeah.
And Bolton, had been in government service before and was seen then as a very, very difficult and prickly individual to work with. Trump has just found out the very same thing. Mattis, I don't know enough about, his service in the military previous to that. Colin Powell is often held up as an example of somebody who has now twice said he won't vote for Trump.
Yeah.
But in my recollection, Colin Powell never voted for the Republicans. He didn't vote for Mitt Romney. He didn't vote for George W. Bush. He didn't vote for who else ran for the Republicans. I mean, he announced in 2008, for example, he was voting for Obama.
Yeah.
He didn't vote for John McCain. And
so it's not that surprising.
It's not that surprising. It's just deja vu all over again.
Yeah.
So, and that's fine. Colin Powell can vote for whoever he wishes to vote for, but don't try to sell it to me as if it's some kind of a major, signal on the road. It's not.
Yeah.
He's just being consistently voting Democrat.
Yeah.
So, there is no question that the Trump presidency has been chaotic.
Yeah.
But, come with me. I'll show you some other presidencies that were chaotic.
Fair enough.
John Kennedy, in the early 60s, he was held up as being, the new wave. Everybody was gaga about John Kennedy. Before too long, the Bay of Pigs comes along, a major foreign policy fiasco. I remember as a little boy, I would have been about maybe 9, 10 years old at the time, we were all living in fear that we were on the brink of a nuclear war.
Yeah.
Now, it got diffused, and so, that never transpired. But
Interesting how what happens when you get shot, and in a few years pass by, how a presidency gets viewed, because something like that is almost completely forgotten.
Yeah.
When we think of Kennedy now.
Yeah. I don't think it can be said that Kennedy in any way, although he was only president for 3 years, that it was in any way a successful term.
Yeah.
So, and never mind, all the lack of morality that existed back then as well. It's also little known.
Yeah.
So Lyndon Johnson, he was the major. He ramped up the Vietnam War more so than anybody else.
Yeah.
That can hardly be written up as a success. The New Deal that he promoted, which really expanded welfare programs more than anything else, have had a very pernicious effect on American life. It rewarded people for staying home, not having to work, and that kind of thing, and abdication of personal responsibility. All of those things flowed out of Lyndon Johnson's legislative program. And there were others, that.
Yeah, crazy. Because
So, yes, Trump is unique. He's chaotic.
Where are the people that voted for him in a country like Canada?
They're around.
And
But they haven't had that rallying opportunity.
Yeah.
That Trump presented.
You think it's also a cultural thing?
A little bit. A Canadian isn't an American, and vice versa. They have totally different histories.
Yeah.
As countries, and I, as a Canadian, I say this to our shame, I think, but when the Americans sing the Star Spangled Banner, they do that with more gusto than we sing "Oh Canada."
Yeah.
It's just a fact, right? So that nationalist spirit in the States is stronger than it is in Canada. And we now have a prime minister in Canada who believes very much in this concept of post-nationalism. We're all citizens of the world now. We happen to live in this thing that's called Canada, but that's less important. That's a very interesting thing to know about Justin Trudeau. I think what Trump, he was able to tap into something.
Yeah, 100%.
He came from nowhere, had never been elected to anything whatsoever, and he's a billionaire, and people would say, how does somebody like that connect with Middle America? And yet he did.
Because they accused Mitt Romney of not winning because for that very reason.
Yeah, that's right. But Trump was, I remember, I try to tune into the American campaign 4 years ago from time to time, and I was watching Trump at a campaign stop. I think it was in Detroit. It was certainly in Michigan. A largely black audience.
Yeah.
And, in his unabashed way, Trump said, well, I understand you folks all vote Democrat very reliably. How's that going for you so far?
Yeah.
And I thought, wow. And you're going to see in this coming election that a larger percentage of black people in America will be voting for Donald Trump.
So you think he's going to win again?
That alone almost would guarantee it.
Yeah. That's the big thing for Biden. Or that's what they say. That's what kind of saved him in the primary was the black vote.
The black vote in one state. That got re-energized his campaign, and the Democratic Party really wasn't that interested in their non-member Bernie Sanders anyway.
That's right.
When Biden seemed to get some oxygen in South Carolina, they said, okay, now we're all on board, all in, and away they went. But Biden again. He exhibited some of that same arrogance that Hillary Clinton did. Another turning point in the 2016 election was the day that Hillary Clinton referred to Trump's supporters as deplorables.
That's right.
You've no idea how huge that was. It was an unforced error, It came out of nowhere, but it betrayed a mindset. I know it sure got me right in the gut.
Yeah.
So what does Biden say just recently? If you're voting for Trump, you ain't black.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Well, that's of the same genre.
Yeah, it is.
Really, it is. It's a denigrating sort of view of those people that you'd like to have their vote, but really you don't think much of them. There was some of the other partisan people that were working for Hillary Clinton who used to, and that were also involved in some of the shenanigans at the FBI. Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, they had a nice little chat going on between them about they were in Walmart and they could smell the Donald Trump supporters.
Yeah, that's pretty rough.
Pretty rough stuff. Pretty rough stuff. But that is the sort of the thing that animated those people.
Yeah.
Completely despised Trump and anybody who would support him. And yet the people that were supporting him found in him something that was relevant to them. He spoke to their issues.
And he didn't lie either, because you see this in marketing nowadays too. It seems like the common trend is now in marketing is to be as real as possible and to back off on the polishing because people just know it's fake because they're so used to that now. Mm-hmm. But also in politics, when Donald Trump says something, like people say how he is in public and private, it's the same guy. If anything, he's nicer in private. But most politicians, it's the opposite.
That's right. That's exactly right. He's, as much as a lot of people would be startled, he's a pretty genuine article when you see him out in public. And I've heard, too, that in private he actually is genuinely actually a pretty nice guy.
Yeah.
But I've been in circles where even to say that in private Donald Trump is a nice guy, well, you just about have worn out your welcome right there. We all together got to grow up.
That's right.
You
got to be able to have an opinion and not be looked at as
exactly right. I served in a right of center government here in British Columbia. Do you think it's fun for me to watch a left-wing group now running the province? No, it's difficult. It's really hard some days.
Yep.
But, you keep it civil. I can have a good conversation with Adrian Dix or John Horgan and whatnot,
That's the only way that's the only way you're going to accomplish anything and change their mind.
They and I, we all know that we don't agree on certain things, but we can keep it civil. The civility never really goes away. Where in the U.S. that has been completely thrown aside, and I really think.
But don't you think it's a little bit Donald Trump's fault a little bit as well when he at these rallies when he's yelling "lock her up" and those kind of things as much as it rallies his own base?
Oh, he's fed into it. There's no question about it, and he probably thought at the time that it was to his advantage to do so. So, when you're running as a first-time candidate and you're not really that experienced at these things, you're going to do what you think's going to work.
Yeah.
It was crude, offensive. Yeah, sure. Not pretty to watch, but it worked.
Yeah. Entertaining to watch, though.
Hey?
Entertaining to watch.
Yeah, to a degree. It is. So this campaign coming up, the next 4 months, is going to be even less pretty to watch, I'm afraid.
I'm excited about the debates, especially with Biden maybe having dementia, maybe not.
I think in the case of Biden, the fact that he's being allowed to run by his family and others is cruel. I don't know whether it's dementia or what it is, but he clearly is not as sharp as he once was.
That's right.
He's often confused and what have you. He's,
At 78, I mean.
Yeah. It's that said though, Trump is now 74, so right. He's not a whole lot younger, but his faculties are still much more together than those of Joe Biden. So in many ways, it's really too bad that here we're kind of anticipating a debate between those two guys, and a difference maker may well be the advancing dementia of Joe Biden in this case.
What happens?
That's no credit to democracy.
No. Do you know what happens if, for example, he drops out now? Who takes his spot? Do you know how that system works?
Well, dropping out now is not going to happen because
it would just be his VP automatically that takes the spot, or
He's not going to be allowed to drop out, frankly, between now and November the 3rd. Not going to happen, because the question is, who do you replace him with then? Well, you know who's going to come charging up right now? Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
He's going to demand that in the absence of Biden, it's his.
Yeah.
And he has, I think, some credible reason for suggesting that.
Yeah.
The establishment in the Democratic Party would never put up with that.
Yeah.
They don't want Bernie Sanders because he's almost a communist, really, in the things that he believes in. So they're going to keep Biden there until after the election. What's going to be extremely critical for Joe Biden is who his VP running mate is going to be, because there's an extremely good chance that were he to be elected on November the 3rd, before that 4-year term was out, that VP would then be the president.
Yeah. Especially, like, it is scary, especially if it's someone like Kamala Harris or in my opinion, that doesn't seem like a good person to be president.
Kamala Harris, no. There's Elizabeth Warren, those kinds of people. I mean, I'm sure that Donald Trump would love to see Elizabeth Warren being his running mate.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a lot of attention paid to that appointment because. Everybody, whether they're prepared to admit it or not, most people are prepared to admit that Joe Biden is beyond his best before date.
Yeah. And
so that VP appointment is going to be so critical for him. Yeah.
One last question for you. So we talked about climate change quite a bit. Resources for people to go read up on it. It depends, I don't know, the audience, what side they're on, if they believe it's a hoax or, as some people say, or if they're very on board with it. It's good to read both sides and stuff like that. So
that's right.
For the side that you believe in more, like some articles or writers or books you recommend people read?
There's a think tank in the United States called the Cornwall Alliance.
Okay.
Calvin Beisner is the head of that, and they've done some really good work. The Heartland Institute in the United States, they've done some really good work as well, and it's through those kinds of organizations that I kind of happen upon good reading material. And one thing leads to another. The Cato Institute sometimes has some good material on that as well. The Manhattan Institute, some good recommendations for books. But there's a lot of good reading material all over the place.
And those organizations you wouldn't say are like the hardcore right wingers that are just saying it's completely fake. There's no such thing. We shouldn't change anything, or is it just more like actual scientists that are part of these organizations that are giving this information out? Or
there's a great variety amongst those who don't believe that the current track that we're on dealing with climate change is correct, but there's great variety amongst them.
Okay, it's like Democrat, Republican, liberal. There's
that too, but also in terms of the extent to which they feel there is a problem. Many of them fall into the category of, yes, there's been some warming. Carbon dioxide might have had a little to do with it, but it is far and away not the biggest problem that we face today. And that if we do want to do something about it, the policy selections that we make are very important. I think of somebody like Bjorn Lomborg, Danish fellow, statistician by trade, who is very environmentally minded. But because he's very interested in his professional life in data and statistics, he has figured out that this sort of mindless process of let's get rid of CO2 is actually not at all beneficial in terms of improving the economic and the environmental condition of the world and its people. And there's other guys like Paul Dreesen, and there's so many others. And so, there's others that are very libertarian. There are those as well.
Yeah.
And so everybody has something to contribute. But when you go to those who are so wedded to this current ideological construct, you're not actually allowed to have that debate. You're not allowed to have the discussion. I don't care what anyone believes, but I sure demand that they stand up and debate the issue.
Yeah.
And
talk about it.
And too often, let me throw out another controversial one. For many, many, many years now, DDT has been banned, right? So
DDT being
it's a pesticide.
okay.
And it is fatal to mosquitoes in a big way. And
That's good. I always say Noah should have swatted 2 mosquitoes.
in those areas of the world where DDT has been used to get rid of mosquitoes, one big disease that's gone is malaria. So in our neo-colonial instinct today, we tell Africa, you may not use DDT.
Yeah.
300 million kids a year die as a result of
Malaria.
being infected with malaria. Is that appropriate?
Yeah.
What's needed is the responsible use of DDT. DDT came into use in Europe and in other places near the end of the Second World War, and it was widely used. People had fleas and lice and all these things that happen at the end of a major world war like that, and they would take a handful and rub it into their hair and all over their bodies. And, I mean, it was being used indiscriminately, and the same thing on crops as well. That's never good, regardless of what substance it is you're using. But then a lady came forward, her name is Rachel Carson, in the United States. She wrote a book in 1962 called The Silent Spring. And she made the case that DDT was about to cause the extinction of all bird life, hence the name The Silent Spring. And she caught people's imagination. Maybe she was the Greta Thunberg of her day.
Yeah.
And by 1972, Richard Nixon had established the Environmental Protection Act agency, and DDT was banned, and it became banned pretty much all over the world.
Yeah.
And millions and millions and millions of particularly children have died of malaria since. That wasn't necessary.
Interesting.
And,
You'd think that, like, in this age of information and everyone sharing their own ideas with social media and the internet and stuff like that, there'd be less mob mentality now when these people, these ideas catch on. It's like wildfire and everyone jumps on. You'd think there'd be more engaging, but it seems to be less and less. And
there's more mob mentality today than there ever was. And people don't live their lives in the same way. People live in concrete towers and things like where they're actually very out of touch with nature. Even people that live in suburban communities, their lots have become smaller and smaller. They don't scratch around in the dirt anymore. Most people don't grow a garden anymore, so they have lost touch with nature.
Yeah,
and they've replaced what they have had previously with an idealized version, which is often not realistic. And then they're very susceptible to the David Suzukis of the world, who are really good at scaremongering and using pictures of this or that to promote their agenda.
and people don't talk to their neighbors anymore who might have a different idea than them. They all stay in their own homes.
No, that's right. I mean, and when it comes to issues of the environment, they're almost religious in terms of how people glom onto them and hold them dear and hold them sacred.
I actually really believe this, that with religion dying in Western society, it's being replaced
Yes, it is.
by things like the environmental groups and animal rights groups. And not saying like we both agree on you shouldn't take care of the environment or animals, but people need something to latch onto, something with purpose, identity.
I'm trying to just recreate it in my mind. There was a saying I ran across some years ago, and it was something like this, that as society becomes less and less religious, environmentalism takes its place.
That's right.
And paganism takes its place, and the environment is its main religious expression.
Yeah.
And I do believe that there's a lot of truth in that statement. It's going to be an interesting future. Now, what you've seen in the last few months with COVID-19 and there was, pretty massive, reining in of economies everywhere.
Yeah.
And that got some of these folks who are very ardent environmentalists quite enthused, because they have seen how quickly society can change. And they're now looking at that and saying, whoa, maybe we can use stronger levers to change things.
I remember that actually, like with in China with Wuhan in January.
Yeah.
Those cities got locked down
Big time.
and I remember saying to some colleagues that they'll never fly in America.
Mm-hmm.
They'll never fly in Western culture, but it happened really quickly.
Yeah, it did. It did. And, we're still, living with some of those aspects today. And I'm not saying that's all bad.
Yeah.
But, what I have noticed is that there's quite a variety in terms of people's willingness to go along with the government edict of the day. There are some who tend to be let's use the term libertarian, and, government's not going to push me around. But there's a lot of people who, take the government direction extremely seriously, to a fault, I would argue.
Yeah.
Most responsible governments today are saying, well, do the right and responsible thing. Here's what we suggest you do. There haven't been too many examples of, brutal enforcement of those guidelines.
Yeah.
But, there has been a very strong impulse in lots of areas. People say, oh, no, we've been told, we're not going to work. I know of cases where people are saying we're going to keep our business shut down until there's a vaccine. Pretty extreme stuff.
Gotta have a lot of money in the bank to say that.
Yeah, or not. They might be risking, losing their business entirely.
Yeah.
But it gave me a bit of insight as to, if somebody is sufficiently alarmed and concerned about climate, what kind of decisions would they be prepared to make, to mitigate climate change?
Yeah.
And you know what? And the climate, we can do whatever we like, but the climate will continue to do what it's always done: change.
Yeah.
So
I'd actually be curious to see if, like, over the next 10 years, we had another 70s experience, 1970s experience of the world getting cooler and stuff like that. I wonder what that would. Wonder what they would say next, because they're not going away.
No, they're not. They're not going away. And it's funny you say that, because there is some chance that is exactly what will happen. The reason for that is that sunspot activity has almost completely shut down on the face of the sun, which was the same thing that went on in the 1600s when we had the little ice age. There is a definite correlation between Earth's climate and the amount of sunspot activity. That's scientifically well proven. And it's a rare thing when there is almost no sunspot activity, and that is what we find today. There's almost no sunspot activity
Sunspot
whatsoever.
activity, that's if the flares come off?
That's right. That's right. And so we will see the climatic results of that. Now, it remains to be seen how long that sunspot activity will be absent. It might be for a short period of time. It might be for decades.
Yeah,
Don't know at this point. But it is a great influence. And right now, that influence would tell us that there's a good possibility that temperatures will moderate to the downside.
Yeah, interesting.
So
cool. John, thank you for coming on. I appreciate it. It's very interesting.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I have opinions on a few things.
Yeah. I'm sure I'll be asking you back on again on a few more opinions. So.
I'd love to do it. It's but you know what? I always tell people these things are important.
Yeah.
They really are. When it comes to climate, there's huge amounts of money being invested as a result of particular policy directions. Well, that's money that's not available to do other things. That limits opportunities in other areas, limits personal opportunities and futures and that kind of thing. So it's really important. It's all about, at the end of the day, a great motivator for me has always been, leaving a good society for our children and grandchildren to.
Which is interesting. The environmentalists say that's their same motivation.
Yeah, I know.
So we actually have the same. We have the same end goal.
We have the same end goal, but we conceive it quite differently.
Yeah.
But that is an important thing. I want them to grow and to thrive and to be able to have those opportunities that we all had, and in a responsible environmental regulatory construct for sure. But some of these things, I think, are limiting that future potential.
Yeah. I think it's really key, though, to talk about that you have the same end goal. Because as people listen to this show and stuff like that, and you talk about different worldviews and stuff like that, to find a common ground on something and start there in your discussion. Because yelling at each other or going at each other online on social media and stuff like that, and saying mean things that doesn't help. Doesn't fix anything.
No, it doesn't. It might be good theater for 5 minutes, but it doesn't solve anything. So you're right. There's that end goal. Our definition within that might be a little bit different as to what we see as a positive future.
Yeah.
But just the fact that that would motivate myself just as much as David Suzuki, for example.
Yeah.
He has many grandchildren as well.
Yeah.
Then perhaps that's a good starting place and work backwards from there.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help spread the word, please leave us a 5-star review and tell your friends and family about this show. We have new episodes every other Friday. We are available on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can follow this show on Instagram and Facebook at the handle @Furiously Curious Show.